The twin suns of Solara cast long, skeletal shadows across the ribbed vault of the biodome. Ethan, sweat beading on his brow, adjusted his macro lens, focusing on a cluster of crimson bloom. The vibrant, almost violently red flora was a recent import from the outer reaches of Solara, and he, as the lead xenobotanist, was tasked with acclimating it to the controlled environment within the human habitat. It was beautiful, mesmerizing even, but today, a tremor of unease ran through him as he noticed a faint dusting of rust-colored spores on a few of the delicate petals. He touched the affected bloom gingerly. The discoloration spread under his fingertip, a chillingly fast progression. He knew instantly, with a sick lurch in his stomach, this was no ordinary blight. This was the crimson rot, whispered about in hushed tones back at the research outpost, a fungal plague that decimated native Solarian flora, leaving behind brittle, lifeless husks. Ayla, he murmured, half hoping the Solarian consciousness node wouldn't respond. The large crystal formation at the edge of the dome shimmered faintly, a ripple of violet light pulsing across its facets. He'd only begun to learn the subtleties of Solarian communication, but this felt like confirmation. Dread coiled in his gut. If the rot had reached the human biodome, it meant it was already widespread in the Solarian network. Ayla's light pulsed again, a slower, mournful flicker. It was a stark contrast to the usually vibrant, almost joyous bioluminescence that Ethan had grown accustomed to. He felt a pang of something he hadn't expected, sympathy, perhaps even something akin to sadness, for this alien being he barely understood. He spent the next few hours collecting samples, the crimson stain spreading relentlessly across the crimson bloom, a grim reminder of the impending crisis. He could already feel the rising panic in the dome, the subtle shift in the air as whispers turned to shouts, hope to fear. He was supposed to be their reassurance, their symbol of human ingenuity, the man who would find a way to protect them. But looking at the infected flora, at the sorrowful glow emanating from Ayla's crystal, he felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. He thought of his family back on Earth, the faces he might never see again if this plague consumed Solara. Then he thought of Ayla. The subtle vibrations he'd felt emanating from her crystal whenever he spoke, the delicate interplay of light and shadow that seemed to mimic his emotions. He dismissed it as his own wishful thinking at first, a human tendency to anthropomorphize the alien, but what if he wasn't imagining it? What if, beneath the alien logic of the Solarian network, there was something else, something responsive? Something reaching out to him as surely as he was reaching out to it. He touched the surface of Ayla's crystal, his hand hovering hesitantly over the smooth, cool surface. He half expected a recoil, a jolt of energy, but there was nothing. Just the faint thrumming of energy beneath his fingertips, the slow, sorrowful pulse of violet light. "We'll find a way," he whispered, the words both a promise to Ayla and a prayer to a universe that seemed increasingly hostile. He looked at the two suns setting over the desolate Solarian landscape beyond the dome, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. A beautiful, deadly backdrop to the beginning of a desperate fight for survival. The airlock hissed, the heavy door groaning open to reveal the crystalline cavern where Ayla resided. Ethan stepped inside, the faint hum of the Solarian network a constant presence here, a subtle vibration that resonated deep in his bones. Ayla's crystal, a towering structure of amethyst and quartz, pulsed with a soft violet light, a somber echo of its usual brilliance. He approached cautiously, holding a small datapad containing his preliminary findings on the crimson rot. "It's spreading faster than we anticipated," he said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "I've detected traces in the outer sections of the biodome's root system. It's attacking the Solarian flora we've integrated for oxygen production." A wave of crimson light rippled across Ayla's surface, a visual representation of her distress. "The network, it weakens," she communicated through a series of subtle vibrations that Ethan was beginning to interpret. "The rot consumes." He reached out, hesitantly at first, then placed his hand on the cool, smooth surface of the crystal. He half expected a reaction, a spark, or a recoil, but there was nothing, only the faint thrumming of energy beneath his fingertips, like a heartbeat. The action felt strangely intimate, a bridge between two vastly different life forms. A memory flashed through his mind, the cool, clammy hand of his sister, Sarah, in his own just before she succumbed to the plague that swept through Earth's refugee camps. He'd promised her he'd find a new world, a safe world. Now, here he was, on the verge of losing another home to another unstoppable disease. He pushed the memory aside, focusing on the present. "We can still fight this," he said, his voice filled with a conviction he wasn't entirely sure he felt. "Human biotechnology, we can adapt. We can find a way to bolster your defenses." A flicker of emerald light pulsed through the crystal. "Hope? Or something else?" "Your emotions," Ayla vibrated, the feeling strange and unfamiliar against his palm. "They are unique." He realized he was still touching her, his hand resting against the crystal. He hadn't meant to leave it there for so long, but the contact felt strangely comforting, grounding. "Humans, we feel as individuals," he explained, choosing his words carefully. "It makes us resilient. Adaptable." "Resilience," she echoed, the light shifting to a thoughtful blue. Days bled into weeks, filled with frantic research and increasingly desperate attempts to contain the rot. Ethan worked tirelessly, fueled by a mixture of duty and a growing, unsettling attachment to Ayla. He found himself drawn to the crystalline cavern, not just to monitor the rot's progress, but to talk to Ayla, to share his hopes and fears, his memories of Earth, his dreams of a future where humans and Solarians could coexist. He learned that Ayla, though a part of the larger Solarian consciousness, possessed a unique perspective, a nascent individuality that set her apart. She confided in him her growing doubts, her fear that she was betraying her own kind by placing her trust in a human. "Cooperation is not natural for us," she vibrated one evening, the violet light dimming. "We are one. Individuality is a flaw." "It's also our strength," Ethan countered. "It allows us to adapt, to innovate." The rot continued to spread, pushing closer to the human biodome. Panic was setting in amongst the colonists. Some called for abandoning Solara, returning to the relative safety of the established human colonies. The thought of leaving gnawed at Ethan, the promise he'd made to his sister echoing in his mind. But the thought of leaving Ayla? One morning, he found Ayla's crystal flickering erratically, a frantic pulse of red and orange. "They are coming," she vibrated, the fear palpable. "The rot, it has twisted them. They intend to purge the human presence." A group of rogue Solarian drones, infected by the rot and now hostile, were approaching the biodome. Ethan knew their weaponry could breach the dome's defenses. Before he could react, Ayla's crystal flared with an intense white light. Then, a small shard, no bigger than his thumb, detached itself from the main structure and floated towards him. "Take this," Ayla vibrated weakly. "It contains a message." A plea for understanding. He realized what she was asking him to do, to venture into the heart of the infected territory, to negotiate with the rogue drones, to risk his life to avert a war. It was suicide. He took the shard, his fingers brushing against the cool, smooth surface. It was a tangible piece of Ayla, a physical connection that resonated with the growing bond between them. He felt a surge of protectiveness, a fierce determination to honor her trust. He looked back at Ayla's crystal, now dimmed and flickering, weakened by the effort. He knew he might not return. He thought of Earth, of the family he had lost, the future he had dreamed of. Then he looked at the shard in his hand, the small, pulsing fragment of Ayla's consciousness. He turned and walked towards the airlock, the heavy door hissing open before him, revealing the desolate, crimson-tinged landscape beyond. He walked towards the rising suns, a single human against a hostile alien world, carrying a fragile hope for a shared future. The lab was a controlled chaos of beakers, nutrient solutions, and glowing Solarian flora samples. Ethan's fingers, stained crimson from crushed petals, flew across the datapad, analyzing the rot's relentless advance through the crystalline network. Ayla's distress permeated the air, a low thrum of anxiety that resonated deep within him. "It's adapting," he muttered, frustration tightening his chest. "The current antifungal agents are ineffective." A wave of violet light washed over the shard of Ayla's crystal he kept on his workbench, a constant reminder of her vulnerability, her trust in him. He'd learned more about the Solarians' interconnected consciousness in the past few days, how the rot's fragmentation was not just a physical threat but a psychic one, tearing at the very fabric of their being. He hesitated, then reached out, his fingertip brushing against the smooth surface of the shard. The contact was electric, a rush of warmth that spread up his arm. He almost pulled back, fear gripping him, fear of harming her, of the sheer alienness of it all. But he held firm, the warmth settling into a comforting hum. It was the closest he'd come to physical contact with Ayla, and it filled him with a strange mix of wonder and trepidation. "I need to understand your biology better," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Your cellular structure, your energy pathways, everything." A ripple of emerald light danced across the shard. "Knowledge is shared," Ayla vibrated, the feeling gentle against his skin. But it is not enough. He realized what she meant. Scientific understanding wasn't enough. He needed empathy, a deeper connection to her experience, to her fear. He closed his eyes, focusing on the faint vibrations emanating from the shard, trying to feel what she felt, the creeping dread, the slow unraveling of herself. The memory of Sarah's frail hand in his resurfaced, the cold, clammy touch a stark contrast to the warmth of Ayla's shard. He'd promised her a safe world, a future free from the plagues that ravaged Earth. Now, that same promise, made to a being from another world, fueled his desperate search for a cure. A low alarm sounded through the dome, a chillingly familiar wail. "Perimeter breach," a voice announced over the intercom. "The rot-infected drones, they're attacking the west quadrant." Ethan felt a jolt of fear, a cold dread unlike anything he'd felt since the refugee camps. He thought of the other colonists, of the fragile peace they'd built on this hostile world. The shard flared with a blinding white light. "I can reason with them," Ayla vibrated, the feeling urgent, desperate. "They are lost, confused. But I can reach them." "It's too dangerous," he argued. "They're infected, hostile." "They could." He couldn't finish the sentence. He knew what they could do. They could shatter her consciousness, extinguish the unique spark that was Ayla. "I must try," she insisted. A sliver of the shard, smaller than a grain of rice, detached itself and floated towards the airlock. "Take this to them. It is a key to my voice." He knew this was a gamble, a desperate act of faith. If the drones misinterpreted her message, it could trigger all-out war. He looked at the sliver in his hand, a tiny, pulsing fragment of Ayla's essence. He understood the risk she was taking, the profound trust she was placing in him. And he understood, with a sudden clarity, that he couldn't leave. Not now. Not when she needed him most. He turned away from the transport ship preparing for emergency evacuation, the flashing lights reflecting in his tear-filled eyes. He turned away from the hope of returning to Earth, of rebuilding his life amidst the familiar chaos of humanity. He turned, instead, towards the airlock, towards the crimson-tinged horizon, towards the unknown. He carried within him not only a sliver of Ayla's consciousness, but also a sliver of her hope, a fragile hope for understanding, for connection, for a future where human and Solarian could stand together against the encroaching darkness. The rhythmic pulse of Solara's twin suns hammered against the biodome, mirroring the frantic beat of Ethan's heart. The crimson rot was no longer a creeping threat, it was a wildfire, consuming the crystalline network at an alarming rate. Reports of infected Solarian drones turning hostile flooded his datapad. The human colony was on high alert, the evacuation order imminent. He sat in his lab, surrounded by the remnants of failed experiments, wilted flora samples, shattered beakers, and the lingering scent of antiseptic. Ayla's shard pulsed faintly on his workbench, a fragile beacon of hope in the gathering gloom. He reached out, his fingertip hovering over the smooth, cool surface. He still hesitated, even now, to touch her directly. It felt intimate. Too intimate. He'd studied the shard's molecular structure, its intricate energy pathways. He knew, logically, that his touch couldn't harm her, but the fear lingered, a visceral reminder of the vast gulf that separated their species. He finally made contact, the shard responding with a wave of comforting warmth. They're preparing to evacuate, he told her, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. I should go too. A flicker of sadness, a dim violet, pulsed across the shard. You will leave? Guilt twisted in his gut. Leaving Solara meant abandoning Ayla, leaving her to face the rot alone. He thought of Sarah, her frail hand clutching his as she faded away. He couldn't bear the thought of experiencing that loss again, not with Ayla. I don't want to, he confessed, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. But my duty. Duty, Ayla echoed, the light shifting to a puzzled blue. Is it stronger than a connection? Her question cut him to the core. He realized, with a sudden clarity, that his duty wasn't just to humanity. It was to Ayla too. He'd promised to protect her, to find a way to coexist. The alarm klaxon blared, shaking the very foundations of the biodome. The rot-infected drones, a panicked voice announced over the intercom, they've breached the outer defenses. They're heading for the central crystal nexus. The nexus. The heart of the Solarian network. If the rot reached it, it would be catastrophic, not just for Ayla, but for all Solarians. Ayla's shard pulsed frantically. I must go, she vibrated, the feeling sharp, urgent. I can reason with them. Stop the attack. He knew it was a suicide mission. The infected drones were driven by a primal, destructive urge. They wouldn't listen to reason. No, he said, grabbing the shard, holding it tight in his hand. It's too dangerous. A blinding white light erupted from the shard. A sliver, infinitesimal, detached itself and floated towards the airlock. This is my only hope, Ayla vibrated weakly. Take it to them. Tell them, I believe, Din Kas. He looked at the sliver, at the immense trust it represented. He looked at the transport ship poised for takeoff, the escape route back to a life he no longer wanted. He made his choice. He raced towards the airlock, the sliver of Ayla clutched in his hand, a single human against an army of infected drones, a fragile hope against the overwhelming tide of despair. He didn't look back. He was staying. For her. For them. For the future they could build together. The future he now believed in, a future worth fighting for. The Nexus chamber pulsed with a sickly orange light, the air thick with the stench of decaying flora. The rot-infected drones swarmed around the central crystal, their crystalline bodies distorted, twisted by the fungal plague. He approached cautiously, holding up the sliver of Ayla's consciousness, the tiny fragment pulsing with a faint violet light. I come, with a message, he called out, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. From Ayla. She believes, there's still hope. The drones paused, their movements erratic, their bioluminescence flickering between orange and crimson. Then, without warning, one of them lunged, its crystalline claws slashing towards him. The attack caught him off guard. He stumbled back, the sliver flying from his hand, landing near the central crystal. Chaos erupted. The drones attacked in a frenzy, their corrupted logic interpreting his presence as a threat. He dodged their attacks, desperately trying to retrieve the sliver, knowing that it was their only hope. Suddenly, the central crystal flared with an intense white light. Ayla's voice, amplified 1,000-fold, resonated through the chamber. Stop, she commanded, the sound both beautiful and terrifying. I am Ayla. I believe in him. The drones froze, their movements stilled, their light flickering uncertainly. He seized the moment, scooping up the sliver and holding it aloft. She offers you peace, he shouted, his voice hoarse. She believes, we can coexist. The drones hesitated, the crimson light in their bodies slowly fading, replaced by a hesitant blue. It was a start. A fragile, tenuous start, but a start nonetheless. He looked up at the central crystal, at the fading light that represented Ayla's weakened state. He'd made his choice, and now, together, they would face the consequences. He didn't know what the future held, whether they could truly bridge the gap between their species. But as he stood there, surrounded by the still hostile drones, the sliver of Ayla's consciousness warm in his hand, he felt a flicker of hope, a belief in the impossible, a belief in the power of connection, even across the vastness of interstellar space. The lab's air hung heavy with the scent of ozone and desperation. Days blurred into a sleepless cycle of research, each failed experiment a fresh layer of grime on Ethan's already weary hands. The crimson rot, a relentless crimson tide, was advancing through the Solarian network, its tendrils reaching ever closer to the central nexus, the heart of Ayla's consciousness. Evacuation orders had been issued, the transport ship poised for takeoff, its running lights a stark counterpoint to the somber violet glow emanating from Ayla's shard. It pulsed faintly on his workbench, a fragile reminder of her trust, her vulnerability. He should leave, he knew. Return to Earth, rebuild a life amidst the familiar chaos of humanity. But the thought of abandoning Ayla, leaving her to face the rot alone, felt like a betrayal of everything he'd come to believe in. He reached out, his fingers finally overcoming their hesitation, brushing against the smooth, cool surface of the shard. A wave of warmth flowed into him, a gentle reassurance. "They're leaving," he murmured, his voice heavy with unshed tears. I should go too." The shard pulsed with a dim violet light, a flicker of sadness. "You will leave?" He closed his eyes, Sarah's cold hand in his, a phantom ache in his chest. He'd promised her a new beginning, a safe haven from Earth's plagues. Now, he was on the verge of abandoning that promise, not for a new world, but for something far more profound, a connection with a being so different, so utterly alien, yet so deeply understood. "My duty," he began, but the word felt hollow, a betrayal of the bond he'd forged with Ayla. "Duty," she echoed, the light shifting to a puzzled blue. "Is it stronger than a connection?" Her question pierced through his carefully constructed defenses, revealing the raw, aching truth. His duty wasn't just to humanity, it was to Ayla, to the fragile hope of coexistence they represented. A tremor shook the biodome, the klaxon wailing. "The rot-infected drones," a panic voice announced over the intercom, "they've breached the outer perimeter. They're converging on the nexus." Ayla's shard pulsed frantically, a desperate crimson flare. "I must go," she vibrated, the feeling sharp, urgent. "I can reason with them. Stop the attack." He knew it was a suicide mission. To venture into the Nexus chamber, the heart of the Solarian network, now swarming with hostile drones, it was madness. "No," he said, gripping the shard, his knuckles white. "It's too dangerous." A blinding white light erupted from the shard. An infinitesimal sliver detached itself and floated towards the airlock. "This is my only hope," Ayla vibrated weakly. "Take it to them. Tell them I believe in us." In that moment, all his doubts, all his fears, dissolved. He wasn't just a scientist, a xenobotanist. He was a conduit, a bridge between two worlds, entrusted with a fragile hope for the future. He turned away from the waiting transport, from the receding hope of returning home, and raced towards the airlock, the sliver of Ayla pulsing warm in his hand. He was staying. For her. For them. For the belief that even across the vast expanse of interstellar space, connection could bloom, even amidst chaos and despair. The Nexus chamber was a swirling vortex of orange and crimson light, the air thick with the stench of decay. Rot-infected drones swarmed around the central crystal, their movements erratic, their crystalline bodies contorted by the fungal plague. He raised Ayla's sliver, the tiny fragment pulsing with a faint violet light. "I come with a message," he shouted over the din, from Ayla. "She believes there's still hope." The drones paused, their bioluminescence flickering uncertainly. Then, without warning, one lunged, its crystalline claws slashing towards him. The attack sent the sliver flying from his hand, landing near the central crystal. Chaos erupted. The drones attacked, their corrupted logic interpreting his presence as a threat. He dodged, weaved, desperately trying to retrieve the sliver, knowing it was their only hope. Suddenly, the central crystal blazed with an intense white light. Ayla's voice, amplified 1,000-fold, resonated through the chamber. "Stop," she commanded, the sound both beautiful and terrifying. "I am Ayla. I believe in him." The drones froze, their movement stilled, their light shifting to a hesitant blue. He retrieved the sliver, holding it aloft. "She offers you peace," he shouted, his voice raw with emotion. "She believes we can coexist." The crimson light in the drone's bodies slowly receded, replaced by a tentative blue. A fragile truce, a flicker of hope in the encroaching darkness. He looked up at the central crystal, at the fading light representing Ayla's weakened state. He knew the fight wasn't over. The rot was still a threat, and the fragile peace he'd brokered could shatter at any moment. But as he stood there, surrounded by the still hostile drones, Ayla's sliver warm in his hand, he felt a surge of something he hadn't expected, not just hope, but the beginning of something akin to love, a fragile, impossible love blooming amidst the ruins of a dying world. The nutrient solution shimmered under the lab's harsh fluorescent lights, the genetically modified Solarian flora within pulsing with an unnatural luminescence. Ethan swirled the beaker, his stomach twisting with a familiar knot of anxiety. This was it, the culmination of weeks of frantic research, his last, desperate gamble against the crimson rot. It was a potent cocktail, designed to bolster the Solarian network's defenses, but it was untested, potentially volatile. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and it could accelerate the rot spread, obliterating any remaining hope. Ayla's shard, nestled within a specially designed cradle on his workbench, pulsed with a soft, anxious violet. He'd grown accustomed to its presence, to the subtle vibrations that conveyed her emotions, her fears mirroring his own. He reached out, his fingers brushing the smooth, cool surface. It felt strangely intimate, a physical connection that transcended the vast biological gulf between them. For a moment, he simply held it, drawing strength from the faint warmth radiating into his palm. "It's ready," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But it's risky. We need to integrate it directly into the network, and that means..." He couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. It meant Ayla, in her weakened state, acting as the conduit, risking further fragmentation, perhaps even obliteration. The shard pulsed with a resolute emerald. "I will do it." A sliver, infinitesimal, detached itself and floated towards the nutrient solution. "For my people, for us." He watched, his breath catching in his throat, as the sliver dissolved into the shimmering liquid. The flora within reacted instantly, their luminescence intensifying, shifting from a soft blue to a vibrant, almost violent violet. It was working. But at what cost? A tremor shook the biodome, the klaxon wailing. "Incoming transmission from the crimson drones," a strained voice announced over the intercom. "They demand negotiations. They're approaching the Nexus Chamber." The Nexus Chamber. The heart of the Solarian network. The most vulnerable point. It was a trap. Ayla's shard pulsed frantically. "I must go," she vibrated, the feeling desperate, urgent. "I can reason with them. Prevent war." "No," he said, grabbing the beaker containing the modified flora, his hand shaking. "It's too dangerous. They'll..." Another tremor, stronger this time. The lights flickered, died. Emergency lighting bathed the lab in a cold, red glow. "I believe in you," Ayla's voice, faint but clear, resonated in his mind. "In us." He knew what she was asking of him. To take the cure, the fragile hope they'd created together, into the heart of the enemy territory. To risk everything for a chance at peace. He should have been terrified. But looking at the pulsing violet light emanating from the beaker, feeling the warmth of Ayla's shard in his other hand, fear gave way to a quiet resolve. He thought of Sarah, of the promise he'd made to her, a promise he was now extending to a being from another world. He turned away from the emergency transport, the escape route back to a life he no longer desired, and raced towards the Nexus Chamber, the fate of two worlds resting in his trembling hands. The Nexus Chamber was a cacophony of fractured light and sound. Rot-infected drones swarmed around the central crystal, their crystalline bodies distorted, their bioluminescence a sickly orange. He held up the beaker, his heart pounding against his ribs. "Ayla sends this," he shouted, his voice barely audible above the din. "A cure. A chance for peace." The drones reacted instantly, their movements turning violent. They lunged, their crystalline claws slashing, their corrupted logic interpreting his offering as a threat. One of them struck the beaker, shattering it, the precious nutrient solution splashing across the floor. Despair washed over him. It was over. Then, the central crystal flared with a blinding white light. Ayla's voice, amplified 1,000-fold, echoed through the chamber. "I am Ayla," she boomed, the sound both beautiful and terrifying. "I believe in him. In us." The drones froze, their movements stilled, their orange light flickering uncertainly. He knelt beside the spilled solution, gathering what remained in his trembling hands, his fingers brushing against a shard of the broken beaker, a sharp reminder of the fragility of their hope. He looked up at the central crystal, at the fading light representing Ayla's weakened state. He hadn't saved the station, not yet, but he had saved her. And in that moment, amid the chaos and despair, a fragile, impossible love bloomed, a testament to the enduring power of connection, even across the vastness of interstellar space. The Nexus chamber throbbed with a sickly orange glow, the air thick with the cloying scent of decay. Rot-infected drones, their crystalline bodies twisted into grotesque parodies of their former selves, swarmed the central crystal, a pulsating heart of corrupted energy. Ethan stood at the chamber's edge, the modified Solarian flora clutched in his trembling hands. The violet luminescence of the solution pulsed in rhythm with Ayla's shard, nestled safely in his pocket, a fragile beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. He knew this was a suicide mission. He'd seen what the rot did to the drones, twisting their logic, turning them into mindless agents of destruction. But he had no choice. Ayla was risking everything, pouring her essence into the network, trying to reason with the infected drones, to prevent all-out war. And he, in turn, was risking everything for her, for the fragile dream of coexistence they shared. He took a tentative step forward, his voice barely a whisper in the echoing chamber. "Ayla sends this. A cure. A chance for peace." The drones reacted instantly, their movements becoming a frenzy of jagged, aggressive angles. They lunged, their crystalline claws slashing, their corrupted logic interpreting his offering as a threat. One of them struck his arm, a searing pain radiating through his nerves. He stumbled, the pressure solution splashing across the chamber floor, the violet luminescence dimming, fading. No. Despair washed over him, cold and suffocating. He'd failed. He'd failed Ayla, failed humanity, failed the fragile hope. They lunged, their crystalline claws slashing, their corrupted logic interpreting his offering as a threat. One of them struck the beaker, shattering it, the precious nutrient solution splashing across the floor. Despair washed over him. It was over. Then, the central crystal flared with a blinding white light. Ayla's voice, amplified 1,000-fold, echoed through the chamber. "I am Ayla," she boomed, the sound both beautiful and terrifying. "I believe in him. In us." The drones froze, their movements stilled, their orange light flickering uncertainly. He knelt beside the spilled solution, gathering what remained in his trembling hands, his fingers brushing against a shard of the broken beaker, a sharp reminder of the fragility of their hope. He looked up at the central crystal, at the fading light representing Ayla's weakened state. He hadn't saved the station, not yet, but he had saved her. And in that moment, amid the chaos and despair, a fragile, impossible love bloomed, a testament to the enduring power of connection, even across the vastness of interstellar space. The Nexus chamber throbbed with a sickly orange glow, the air thick with the cloying scent of decay. Rot-infected drones, their crystalline bodies twisted into grotesque parody. But in that moment, amid the chaos and despair, he felt a surge of something he hadn't expected, not just hope, but the burgeoning of a love as alien and beautiful as Solara itself. He knelt beside the spilled solution, carefully scooping what remained into his trembling hands, his fingers tracing the outline of Ayla's shard, nestled safely in his pocket, a tangible reminder of the connection they shared, the future they would fight for, together. He hadn't saved the station, not yet, but he'd bought them time, a precious sliver of time in which to rebuild, to regroup, to find another way. And he knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that as long as they had each other, as long as that fragile spark of connection flickered between them, they had a chance. The crimson tide had receded, leaving behind a landscape of shattered crystal and flickering bioluminescence. The rot, though contained, had taken its toll. Large sections of the Solarian network lay dormant, their vibrant light extinguished, and Ayla's crystal, once a towering beacon of amethyst and quartz, was now fractured, diminished, its light a faint, wavering violet. Ethan sat beside it, the silence of the Nexus chamber amplifying the hollowness in his chest. The modified flora had worked, bolstering the network's defenses, but it hadn't been enough to prevent the damage. He'd managed to push back the Crimson drones, broadcasting Ayla's message of peace, but the truce was fragile, built on the ruins of a near catastrophe. He'd risked everything, defied evacuation orders, stayed behind not for humanity, but for her. And now, in the quiet aftermath, the weight of his decision settled upon him, a heavy cloak of uncertainty. He reached out, his fingers tracing the jagged edge of a fractured section of Ayla's crystal. It was the first time he dared to touch her since the attack, and he held his breath, fearing a recoil, a spark of rejection. But there was nothing, only the faint thrum of energy beneath his fingertips, a fragile heartbeat. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth seep into his skin, a tangible connection to the being who had reshaped his understanding of connection, of love. A part of me is gone, Ayla's voice, faint but clear, resonated within his mind. Fragmented, lost. He opened his eyes, his gaze fixed on the diminished crystal. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words inadequate, hollow. "I should have done more." "You stayed," she vibrated, the feeling surprisingly gentle against his fingertips. "That is enough." He thought of Sarah, her cold hand in his, her last words a plea for a new beginning. He'd found that new beginning, not in a new world, but in a new kind of love, a connection forged in the crucible of crisis, a fragile flower blooming amidst the ruins. He hadn't just saved Ayla, she'd saved him. The airlock hissed, breaking the silence. He turned to see Captain Zhao, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and reproach. "You should have left," Zhao said, his voice flat. "The evacuation is complete. We're abandoning the station." Ethan looked back at Ayla's crystal, at the faint violet light that represented all he'd come to care for. He couldn't leave her. Not now. Not ever. "I'm staying," he said, his voice firm, the decision irrevocable. Zhao's eyes widened. "You're throwing your life away for that?" He gestured dismissively at the fractured crystal. "She's not that," Ethan said, his voice rising, a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed surging through him. "She's Ayla. And she's worth fighting for." Zhao shook his head, disgust etched on his features. "You'll regret this, Ethan. You'll regret it when the rot returns, when the drones attack again." He turned and walked away, the airlock hissing shut behind him, leaving Ethan alone with Ayla, in the quiet heart of a dying station, their fragile love a defiant flicker in the encroaching darkness. "They don't understand," Ayla vibrated, the feeling tinged with sadness. "Our connection." He placed his hand back on her crystal, drawing strength from the faint warmth. "They will," he said, his voice filled with a quiet conviction. "Someday, they will." He didn't know what the future held, whether they could truly bridge the gap between their species, whether humanity and Solarians could ever truly coexist. But as he sat there, in the silent, crimson-tinged twilight, Ayla's fragile light pulsing against his skin, he knew he wasn't alone. And that, in itself, was a new beginning. The twin suns of Solara cast a muted, lavender glow across the ravaged landscape. New crystalline structures, delicate and translucent, pushed through the scorched earth, a testament to the Solarian network's resilience. But the scars of the crimson rot remained, etched deep into the very fabric of their world. Ayla's crystal, once a towering edifice of amethyst and quartz, was now a fraction of its former size, its light a faint, flickering violet. The damage to the network, to her consciousness, was profound, irreparable. Ethan sat beside her, the Nexus chamber eerily silent, the hum of the network a muted echo of its former vibrancy. He traced the contours of a newly formed crystal, its surface smooth and cool beneath his fingertips. It felt fragile, a symbol of the tentative peace he'd brokered with the Crimson drones. he still carried the sting of Captain Zhao's parting words, the condemnation in his eyes, the accusation of betrayal. The evacuation ships had left, leaving him alone on a damaged station, with a fractured alien consciousness and a love that felt both impossible and undeniable. They fear what they don't understand. Ayla's voice, a whisper in his mind, was weaker than he'd ever heard it. Our connection. He reached out, his fingers hovering over her diminished crystal. He still hesitated, even now, to touch her directly, the fear of causing further harm lingering in the back of his mind. But then, remembering the warmth, the comfort he'd found in her touch during the darkest hours of the crisis, he gently placed his hand on the smooth, cool surface. The familiar warmth flowed into him, a silent reassurance. "They'll come around," he murmured, his voice filled with a conviction he didn't entirely feel. He thought of his family back on Earth, the faces he might never see again, the life he'd left behind. He'd come to Solara seeking a new beginning, a safe haven from the plagues that had ravaged Earth, and he'd found it, not in a new world, but in the heart of an alien being. "My people believe that connection is weakness," Ayla vibrated, the feeling tinged with sadness. "Individuality, a flaw. It's also our strength," he countered, remembering Sarah's hand in his, her last words urging him to find a new world, a better world. He'd found it, not in the sterile confines of a human colony, but in the chaotic, vibrant heart of Solara, in the unexpected connection he'd forged with Ayla. A tremor shook the station, the lights flickering, plunging the chamber into momentary darkness. The Crimson Drones. They were back. He felt a surge of fear, a cold dread gripping his heart. The truce was broken. "They misunderstood my message," Ayla's voice was thin, strained. "They believe I betrayed them by aligning with you." He knew what he had to do. He had to go back to the Crimson Drones, try to renegotiate, to explain, to plead for peace, even though it meant facing their wrath, risking his life. He looked at Ayla's crystal, the faint violet light flickering, dimming. "Stay here," he said, his voice tight with emotion. I'll try to reason with them." "No," Ayla vibrated, the feeling urgent, desperate. "I must go. They are my people. I can reach them." He knew it was suicide. But he also knew he couldn't stop her. He could only protect her. He stood beside her as she projected a sliver of her consciousness, a tiny, pulsing fragment of violet light, towards the airlock. He placed his hand on her crystal, the warmth a silent promise. He wouldn't leave her. Not now. Not ever. The Nexus chamber doors hissed open, revealing a delegation of Crimson Drones, their crystalline bodies still contorted, their orange light pulsing with a hostile energy. He stood before them, Ayla's sliver hovering protectively between them, a fragile shield against their mistrust. "We came to negotiate," the lead drone vibrated, its voice a dissonant chorus of corrupted logic. "But we see betrayal." "No," Ethan said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. "This is cooperation. Ayla believes we can coexist." "Coexistence is weakness," another drone countered, its light flaring aggressively. Just as he was about to respond, the station alarms blared, a deafening cacophony of sound. "Incoming asteroid field," a panicked voice announced over the intercom. "Impact imminent. Evacuation protocols initiated." The asteroid field. A random act of cosmic chaos, a final, devastating blow to a world already on the brink of collapse. He had mere minutes to escape. He could reach the remaining emergency transport, his last chance to leave Solara, to return to a life he no longer wanted. Or he could stay, with Ayla, and face their shared fate. He looked at Ayla's sliver, pulsing faintly, her trust in him a tangible presence in the chaotic chamber. He looked at the Crimson Drones, their hostility momentarily forgotten in the face of impending doom. He made his choice. He reached out, his fingers brushing against Ayla's sliver, a physical connection that transcended species, logic, even death. He felt a surge of warmth, a deep, abiding sense of peace. "I'm staying," he said, his voice a quiet whisper in the echoing chamber, a declaration of love in the face of oblivion. The crimson drones, their light flickering between orange and a hesitant blue, remained motionless, their corrupted logic struggling to comprehend his actions. And as the first asteroid struck, tearing through the biodome, sending shards of crystal raining down upon them, he stood beside Ayla's sliver, hand in hand, their fragile love a defiant flicker in the encroaching darkness, a testament to the enduring power of connection, even at the end of all things.